Hello, welcome, and thanks for joining me. Let's spend a few minutes with The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. This book was originally published back in 1961, one of my favorite years, and I read a Random House vintage electronic edition from 2016. So The Death and Life of Great American Cities by Jane Jacobs. This is a work of nonfiction, and it pertains to sort of what makes a city, healthy, what makes a vibrant, healthy city, American city. I decided to read it because the main character in Severance, which I finished reading not long ago and also chatted, which I will link to down in the description, the main character in this novel, work of fiction, was reading The Death and Life of Great American Cities at one point, and so it piqued my interest. Plus, I just like books about cities. So I'm glad I gave it a read, though. Really super interesting. So what it's about, like I said, it's basically about what goes into making a city a healthy city, specifically American city. And so first off, the author distinguishes between a city, a big city, a town, a suburb, a town, and then a rural area. Because what makes each of those places to live healthy are different. So, a lot of times there's been a lot of confusion about that. Like, what's good for a suburb or a small town is not necessarily good for a city. What's good for a city might not be workable in a town. So, she makes that distinction sort of early on in the novel. Then she makes this, not novel, in the book. So she makes this point that, medicine. So medicine at one point took this turn about bloodletting. Doctors in the past thought that, bleeding someone, taking some of their blood away would make them healthier. And so medicine worked under this misconception for, I think, centuries, and before, even after the evidence piled up that it was doing no good, there were doctors still doing this, bloodletting. And she makes this point that there were really three main sort of aspects of urban planning that really affected cities in a negative way, and urban planners have been slow to sort of let go of these ideas. And the three ideas are, the first one's called the Garden City. This was proposed by Ebenezer Howard in 1898. This was in London, and the idea behind this was that a sort of a reaction to overcrowding of industrial London, and how the best way to live in a city would be to sort of make them basically suburbs, which is separate out the businesses from the industry, from the places where people live, and also separated by lots of green space. So a city would be a collection, really, of these idealistic sort of small towns. So that's called the Garden City. The second one that's talked about is called the Radiant City. This is from the 1920s, and Corbusier, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, had this idea of a vertical city where there'd be these huge structures set in the middle of a park with really nothing around it, and people would just sort of have this nature right outside their door, but they would live in these big giant buildings. And then the third one that's talked about is City Beautiful. This was really prominent in the United States because it was a reaction to the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, where there was these monumental avenues where giant complexes like civic centers and arts centers were grouped together. An example of this would be the Lincoln Center in New York, as an example of City Beautiful. But it's taking these arts institutions and governmental institutions outside of where they were sprinkled around a big city maybe at one point, and then sort of concentrating them into a single-use area, which is unhealthy according to the author of this book. So we can see examples of these three things at work in really any city. The Garden City is maybe a planned neighborhood that is really, not dense. It's really got a sort of a sparse population with lots of green belts and things like that. Really a suburban area in a city, but this doesn't work in a city necessarily, which I'll explain more about that here in a bit. Then second, we see the Radiant City, these big vertical things, and a lot of housing projects of the 50s and 60s especially were built where there's these giant buildings that, hundreds and hundreds of people live in, surrounded by a really kind of a green space, but it's not usually used, and it's also somewhat dangerous a lot of times for reasons that I'll also describe. And then the City Beautiful, of course, like I mentioned, the Lincoln Center, Civic Center in San Francisco, the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. These are all centers of or aspects of what was the City Beautiful movement. So yeah, those are the three sort of things, that wrong turns that this author feels that urban planners took in the past, and then she sort of proposes or explains in this book then what would make a healthy city. And so the book itself is divided into 4 different parts, and I thought I would just run through those 4 different parts, and that way it would give you an idea of all the different, or most of the different topics that she touches on. So part 1 is called The Peculiar Nature of Cities, and this is really all about sidewalks. So the sidewalks of a city are really its arteries, she argues, where in a city we need sidewalks, and we need people using those sidewalks for lots of reasons. For safety, she talks about, when there's lots of people on the sidewalk and using the street, actually on it, then there's less chance of crime, because there's lots of eyes watching all the time. And so streets that have really well used pedestrian sidewalks are typically safer. And also the uses of sidewalk contact. This means that people interact with each other on the sidewalks. They may be strangers. She makes this point that cities actually are largely concerned with managing strangers, because you don't know everybody. So therefore, in order to feel safe, you have to feel like there's lots of eyes, there's other people like looking out for you, because you don't know a stranger. You don't know if they're nice or not. And if you're walking down a street, everybody's a stranger to you in a big city a lot of the time. But these sidewalks in the area where you live, you would slowly get to kind of know people, at least from a sidewalk standpoint, of who's who. You might not know personal details about them as you would in a smaller town, but you would know, oh, that's the person that works at the coffee shop or whatever. You would recognize people, and that's sort of necessary, that sort of human contact. Another use she talks about of sidewalks is assimilating children. Another thing, like children are more at risk in a city among strangers, and also it's just busier. But if there's lots of people on a sidewalk along with children, like going to school and things, the children are actually safer, because there's people who will intervene if they see something going on with children, even if they're strangers, to help them. So this is just she gives several examples of this. Then she talks about parks and the uses of neighborhoods. So parks are one of those things that everyone thinks we need more of, but they're healthy parks and there are unhealthy parks. There are certain aspects of parks that make them healthy and then make them unhealthy. And one of them is, how many people are coming and going into the park at different times of day, using the park for multiple uses. If a park is sort of set in a place where it's not used, or it's got a single use, or people only use it at one time a day, the rest of the time it goes underused, and so it becomes often a haven for criminality or other sorts of mischief, she mentions. So yeah, I think that's real interesting. And then neighborhoods, she talks about how they need to be, there's really no such boundary, there's no strict boundary of a neighborhood that maybe the Garden City would want us to have, but a healthy neighborhood doesn't really have a border. It's a fluid border, because people need to come in from outside and the people that live in the neighborhood need to go. So it's kind of a fluid border. So yeah, part 2 is called The Conditions for City Diversity. And here her main point in this whole section is diversity of all kinds of diversity. Diversity of employment, diversity of use, so retail, residential, and also employment. Also small blocks, so that's manageable to walk. It's walkable in small blocks, like people, it's broken up into very small multiple small areas that people can easily access and feel safe in. And difference in ages of the buildings, I thought this was kind of cool, and we'll talk about it more in the next section, but how a healthy neighborhood has new buildings, it has really old buildings, and it has lots of in-between buildings, because this actually facilitates different uses, right? If you have an old building, the rent's sometimes cheaper, so it allows different uses. And so multiple uses, multiple ages of buildings. I just thought that section was so interesting. Then part 3 is forces of decline and degeneration. I thought this section was really cool because it really taught me a lot about what today is known as gentrification. So in this book, she doesn't talk about, the word gentrification never comes up, but this is really the topic that she's discussing, I think, in part 3, because this is talking about how diversity, how a neighborhood can be destroyed. And sometimes it can be destroyed by its own success, where it becomes popular because it's a diverse, it's a healthy neighborhood, so therefore people are drawn to it, and therefore money gets drawn to it, and then change can come too quickly to the neighborhood and ultimately destroy the diversity, where then will it only have a single use or less uses. Also, maybe all the stores where it used to have a diversity of stores, they suddenly become all more expensive, so only certain people can use the neighborhood. The people that have lived there before get driven out, and then the neighborhood becomes more sterile and therefore becomes more unhealthy. So yeah, she's talking about slumming and unslumming. So a neighborhood can go from bad to good because it can slowly evolve. If it's slow enough, it can evolve into being a really good neighborhood if it's had been in trouble in the past. But with careful planning, it can become healthy. But likewise, it has to be, the planners have to watch out for not too much success, or else the diversity is destroyed. So part 4 is talking about different tactics, and here she's talking about different myths about diversity, how diversity, mixed use can bring too much traffic, too many different strangers in there that creates crime, and she really debunks all of these kind of myths in part 4. So I thought that was super interesting. So I'm going to run out of time, so I think I will leave the chat with that, except for this idea of a takeaway of how awesome cities are. A city that is allowed to flourish in these ways that she describes in these books just becomes unique, right? A neighborhood will become unique and a city will become unique. I think in the United States especially, we have to fight this sort of sameness and homogenization that has occurred over the last decades in order for a city to really be, have its own character. It's what it's meant by having character. If people say a city or a neighborhood is having character, what they're really reflecting is that it's unique. It's a work of human creation, and it's different wherever you go because it's responding to just those people who are living there and interacting with that area. So I just think that's really kind of a cool idea. So my next chat, I'm going to leave the chat with that. I could go on. I think whole courses are taught about this book, but I'm out of time, so I'll leave it at that. But my next book chat is going to be Dance, Dance, Dance by Haruki Murakami. I have already finished this, so I do hope to have a chat coming up very soon for Dance, Dance, Dance. So stay tuned for that. Take care. Bye.